The first sensation was the drop. A sickening, weightless lurch that felt less like turbulence and more like the floor had vanished from the universe. Avery Shaw's stomach climbed into her throat, but her hands remained steady on the tablet in her lap. For 2 years as the private secretary to Mr. Kwon Jin-woo, she had mastered the art of absolute composure. It was the first and most important rule of the job. Mr. Kwon did not tolerate hysterics. He sat opposite her in the cream leather seat of his Gulfstream G650, a glass of whiskey untouched on the polished wood beside him. He hadn't looked up from the documents he was reading. Not a flicker of an eyelash. The suit he wore, a tailored Tom Ford in a charcoal so dark it was nearly black, remained impeccable. He was a man carved from stillness, his power expressed not in grand gestures, but in the unnerving economy of his every movement. Another jolt, more violent this time. The plane groaned, a deep, metallic scream that vibrated through the soles of Avery's shoes. This was not turbulence. The flight attendant, a stoic woman named Hannah, stumbled in the aisle, her professional smile frozen in a mask of terror. That is when she made the mistake of looking up. Jin-woo's eyes were on her. They were dark, sharp, and intelligent, but now they held a cold, analytical clarity that was more frightening than any panic. He was not experiencing the chaos. He was dissecting it. He met her gaze, and for a fraction of a second, the world narrowed to the space between them. In his eyes, she saw not fear, but calculation, an assessment. A series of sharp, percussive bangs echoed from the right side of the aircraft. The lights flickered, died, then came back on at half power, casting the cabin in a hellish orange glow. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, a frantic, clipped stream of Korean she couldn't fully parse, but the words for engine failure and brace were universal. Avery's training kicked in. Her mind, a finely tuned machine of schedules and logistics, went blank, replaced by a primal hum of survival. She fumbled with her seatbelt, her fingers suddenly clumsy. Jin-woo was already secured, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He watched her, his expression unreadable. He moved like the room owed him space, and even now, with the room falling out of the sky, it seemed to obey. "Miss Shaw," he said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the rising panic. It was the same tone he used to dictate a memo or dismiss an underling. "Breathe." She obeyed instinctively. A deep, shuddering breath. The air tasted of ozone and fear. The plane began to tilt, a long, horrifying slide toward the earth. Through the window, she saw not the familiar patchwork of city lights they'd left behind, but an endless, terrifying expanse of white. Mountains. Snow-covered peaks reaching for them like jagged teeth. The descent was a symphony of destruction. The shriek of tearing metal, the explosive pop of a window, the roar of the wind. Avery closed her eyes, her mind flashing with an absurdly mundane thought. She hadn't finished proofreading the quarterly asset report. Her entire life, so carefully constructed, was about to be erased by physics and bad luck. The impact was not a crash. It was a cessation, a violent, absolute stop that threw her against her restraints with bone-jarring force. The world became a kaleidoscope of sound and pain, then a profound, ringing silence. The only thing she could hear was the frantic, desperate beat of her own heart. Darkness. Cold. The scent of pine and jet fuel. When consciousness returned, it came in waves. Avery pushed herself up, her body a constellation of aches. The cabin was destroyed, ripped open to the sky like a tin can. Snow was falling softly through the gash in the fuselage, dusting the wreckage in a clean, indifferent layer of white. It was eerily quiet. She was alive. She unbuckled her belt and stumbled into the aisle, her legs unsteady. Hannah was gone. The cockpit was a mangled ruin. A cold dread, far deeper than the mountain air, settled in her bones. She was alone. "Miss Shaw." The voice came from behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping. Kwon Jin-woo was standing near his seat, brushing a dusting of snow from the shoulder of his perfect suit. He was unharmed, save for a thin, precise cut just above his eyebrow from which a single drop of blood welled, a stark ruby against his pale skin. He looked less like a survivor and more like a man who had simply arrived at an inconvenient destination. "Are you injured?" he asked. It was not a question of concern. It was an inventory. I don't think so," she stammered, her voice hoarse. "The pilots? Hannah?" He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The finality of it hit her harder than the crash itself. They were the only ones. A successful, competent secretary and her lethally quiet boss, stranded on a frozen mountaintop. He moved past her, his steps sure-footed amidst the debris. He retrieved a small, black case from a compartment that had miraculously remained intact. The emergency kit. He opened it, his movements efficient and deliberate. He pulled out a satellite phone and an emergency transponder. Avery felt a surge of relief, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. Rescue. They would be found. They would get out of here. Jin-Woo examined the transponder for a moment, his thumb hovering over the activation switch. The small red light blinked, a promise of connection to the outside world. He looked from the device to the vast, silent wilderness outside, then back to her. His gaze was heavy, opaque. What she did not know yet was that this was not a test of survival against nature. It was the beginning of a different kind of captivity. With a calm, deliberate motion, he closed his fist around the small device. There was a sharp crack of plastic. He opened his hand and let the shattered pieces fall into the snow. He then did the same to the satellite phone, snapping it in half over his knee as if it were a dry twig. Avery stared at him, the relief in her chest turning to ice. What did you do?" He looked at her, that single drop of blood still clinging to his brow. His eyes were flat, devoid of any emotion she could name. "No one is coming for us, Miss Shaw," he said. "We were not meant to survive." That was the moment everything changed. The cold of the mountain was nothing compared to the chill that spread through her veins. This wasn't an accident. This was an attack. And the man who had just destroyed their only hope of rescue was not just her boss. He was the target. And now so was she. The first few hours were a blur of calculated action, all of it directed by him. While Avery was still processing the horrifying implication of his words, Jin-Woo was already in motion. He salvaged what he could from the wreckage: 2 thick wool blankets, a first aid kit, a box of protein bars, and a flare gun with 3 cartridges. He worked with a chilling focus, his grief for his crew, if he felt any, buried beneath layers of pure, predatory pragmatism. "We need shelter," he stated, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "The fuselage will not protect us from the wind. Or from them." The word hung in the air, a threat more tangible than the biting cold. Avery wrapped one of the blankets around her shoulders, her movements stiff. Her professional poise had been stripped away, leaving only a raw, frayed nerve of fear. But she was a survivor. Her entire life had been about adapting, about finding a foothold in impossible situations. "There," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She pointed a trembling finger toward a dense clutch of pines down the slope. "The trees will offer some cover. We might find a cave or an overhang." He followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. He gave a single, curt nod. An acknowledgement. It was the first time he had treated her as something other than an employee to be managed. He saw her competence even now. The trek through the snow was brutal. Every step was a battle against the deep powder that sucked at her boots and the thin air that burned in her lungs. Jin-Woo moved ahead of her, breaking a path, his pace relentless. He never looked back to see if she was following, as if her presence was a fact he had already accounted for and moved beyond. They found a shallow cave carved into a rock face, barely large enough for 2 people. It was meager, but it was shelter. Jin-Woo built a small, contained fire just inside the entrance, using pages from a financial report and the splintered wood of a seat back. The flames cast flickering shadows against the stone, creating a pocket of fragile warmth in the vast, indifferent wilderness. They sat in silence, The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind. Avery gnawed on a protein bar that tasted like chalk and despair. She watched him across the small fire. In the dancing light, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. He was staring into the flames, but his focus was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere dark. Why? She finally asked, the question breaking the tense quiet. Why would someone do this? He didn't look at her. In my world, ambition is a terminal illness. My cousin believes he has found the cure. His cousin. The betrayal was a casual, bitter fact. Family. The word, which should have meant safety, was a weapon in his world. He thinks you're dead, Avery realized aloud. That's why you destroyed the beacon. You're not waiting for rescue. You're hiding. My people will be searching, he said, his voice low and gravelly. But my cousin's people will be searching harder. They will not be looking for survivors to rescue. The silence stretched again, thick with unspoken truths. He had dragged her into his war. She was collateral damage, a loose end, a witness. The thought should have terrified her, but strangely, a different feeling was taking root, a stubborn, defiant anger. She would not be a victim. He finally turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. You are a liability, Miss Shaw. I'm also the only person on this mountain who knows how to apply a tourniquet and can identify 3 different types of edible berries, thanks to a grandfather who thought the world was about to end. She retorted, the word sharper than she intended. So, you might want to reconsider your assessment. A flicker of something surprise? Respect. Crossed his features before being suppressed. He almost smiled. It was a ghost of a thing, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, but it was there. It was the first crack in the marble facade. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small, silver locket. He held it in his palm, the firelight glinting off the polished surface. He didn't open it. She was a pianist, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Her name was Mian. She believed there was a part of me that was separate from my business. He paused, his thumb stroking the cool metal. She was wrong. My rival took her to prove a point. I was too slow, too arrogant. I made a mistake, and she paid for it. He wasn't just telling her a story. He was giving her a warning. This is what happens to people who get close to me. This is the price. His wound was not just a memory. It was an active principle of his life. He was isolated not by choice, but by the brutal logic of his own world. Avery felt a pang of something she refused to name. It wasn't pity. It was a dangerous, unwelcome flicker of understanding. She saw the man beneath the monster, the ghost of the person he might have been if he hadn't been born into a life of cold equations and bloody deaths.
She made a choice then.
A small, deliberate one. She could have recoiled. She could have leaned away, reinforcing the wall between them. Instead, she leaned forward, extending her hands toward the fire, a gesture that brought her shoulder almost brushing against his. You won't make that mistake again, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. He finally looked at her, truly looked at her. The distance was gone, replaced by a raw, charged proximity. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the weight of his past and the terrifying uncertainty of their future. He was a killer, a predator, the most dangerous man she had ever met. And in that moment, huddled in a frozen cave, she chose not to run.
She chose to stay.
The next day brought a new level of danger. As the weak morning sun filtered through the trees, they heard it, the distinct, mechanical buzz of a drone. It swept over the valley below them, a black insect against the white snow, its camera eye searching, hunting. Jean Wu extinguished the fire instantly, pulling Avery deeper into the shadows of the cave. They watched as the drone made a second pass, its movements methodical and patient.
Sanctulismin.
They were thorough. We have to move, he whispered, his voice so close she felt the warmth of his breath against her ear. The contact sent an involuntary shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. They'll send a ground team to sweep the crash site. We need to be gone before they arrive. They moved at dawn, leaving the relative safety of the cave for the exposed mountainside. Every shadow of a bird, every rustle of the wind in the pines, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Avery. She was no longer just a survivor of a plane crash. She was prey. Jin-woo moved through the wilderness with the same lethal grace he displayed in a boardroom. He was utterly attuned to his environment, his senses on a razor's edge. He taught her how to walk without leaving deep tracks, how to use the terrain for cover. He was teaching her how to be invisible. He was teaching her his language. They were crossing a narrow, windswept ridge when it happened. The crack of the rifle shot was sharp and clean, echoing across the valley. Instinct took over. Jin-woo's arm shot out, hooking around her waist and hauling her backward. He threw them both behind a large rock formation an instant before a second bullet ricocheted off the stone where they had just been standing, sending chips of granite flying. His body was a shield over hers, pressing her into the snow and rock. The weight of him was absolute, his scent, cedarwood and something cold, like winter air, filling her senses. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady, calm rhythm of his.
He was not panicked.
He was in his element. Sniper, he breathed, his lips against her hair. One, maybe two. On the opposing ridge. He shifted slightly, peering around the edge of the rock. Avery could feel the tension in his muscles, the coiled readiness of a predator. He was calculating angles, distances, options. She, on the other hand, was just trying not to suffocate on the fear. Then she saw it. Tucked into her pocket was the flare gun. Heavy, solid, and utterly useless for signaling a rescue they couldn't afford. But it wasn't just a signaling device. It was a weapon of distraction. "The flare gun," she whispered, her voice tight. "If I fire it to the left, it might draw their attention. Give you an opening." He glanced down at her, his dark eyes searching hers. He was assessing the risk, the probability of success. He saw the resolve in her expression. He gave a sharp, decisive nod. "On my signal." He counted down with his fingers against her back. 3,
2, 1.
He moved. At the same instant, Avery scrambled out from behind the rock on the opposite side, raised the flare gun, and fired. A brilliant red projectile screamed into the sky, arcing far to the left of their position. For a precious second, the sniper's attention would be diverted. It was all the time Jin-woo needed. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, a blur of dark wool against the white snow. He had a small, lethally efficient pistol in his hand, one she hadn't even known he was carrying. 2 sharp reports from his weapon and then silence. A profound, ringing silence. He returned to her side, his face a grim mask. He was breathing heavily, and there was a tear in the sleeve of his expensive suit jacket, a dark stain spreading slowly through the fabric. He was hit. "We need to go," he said, his voice strained, ignoring the injury completely. He pulled her to her feet. She looked at his arm, at the blood. Her first instinct, the human instinct, was to help, to offer aid. But the memory of the Jason rules flashed in her mind. No wound tending. More than that, she saw the look in his eyes. He wasn't a man who accepted help. Weakness was a death sentence. To offer him aid would be an insult. So she just nodded, her throat tight. They found one of the men Sang-chul had sent. He was young, his face pale with shock, a leg twisted at an unnatural angle. His partner was dead a few yards away. The survivor looked at Jin-woo with pure, undiluted terror. Jin-woo knelt beside him, his expression cold and unforgiving. He asked a question in Korean, his voice like chipping ice. The man spat back a defiant answer. Jin-woo's hand moved, and the man screamed, a raw, agonized sound that was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the mountains. Avery felt sick. This was the reality of his world. Not abstract violence, but this. Intimate, brutal, and necessary. The man babbled something, his defiance broken. He was giving information. Names. Locations. Jin-woo listened, his face impassive. When the man was finished, he fell silent, his eyes pleading. He looked past Jin-woo, at Avery. He was appealing to her humanity, to the part of her that wasn't from this world. She had a choice. She could scream, protest, try to intervene. She could cling to the person she used to be, or she could accept the person she was becoming. She met the man's desperate gaze, and she looked away. She turned her back, the silent act of confirmation and allegiance. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. She was no longer just a witness. She was complicit. The sound of the single, final gunshot behind her was a punctuation mark at the end of a chapter of her life. Later, in a new hiding place, an abandoned ranger's cabin, the adrenaline faded, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The weight of her choice settled on her. She hadn't saved the man. She had condemned him with her silence. Jin-woo was watching her from across the small, dusty room. The fire in the hearth cast his face in light and shadow, making him look like a vengeful deity from an old myth. "You saw what I am," he said, his voice quiet. "And you did not run." "There was nowhere to run," she replied, her voice flat. She was lying to herself, and they both knew it. He took a step toward her, then another. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The air crackled with a tension that was more than just fear or survival. It was something new, something dangerous and undeniable. "I told myself keeping you close was a tactical necessity," he said, his voice a low murmur that vibrated through her. "A problem to be managed until I could ensure your silence," he reached out, his fingers gently touching her cheek. His touch was surprisingly warm against her cold skin. "It is no longer just that." He said her name then. Avery. He said it differently than anyone else had. Not like a secretary, not like an asset. He said it like a discovery, like a claim. "What the man told me," Jin-woo continued, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, "Sang-chul knows about you. Not just as my secretary. He knows you were on the plane. He believes you are my only weakness." The enemy had made their move. It was no longer about killing him. It was about using her to break him. The stakes had just become deeply, terrifyingly personal. The final confrontation came 2 days later. They were cornered. His cousin's men had tracked them to the cabin, surrounding it in the pre-dawn gloom. The quiet siege was a war of nerves. Jin-woo stood by the single window, his pistol in hand, a silent sentinel waiting for the inevitable assault. His injured arm was stiff, but he showed no sign of pain. He was preparing to die and to take as many of them with him as he could. But Avery was not the same woman who had boarded that plane. The mountains, the cold, and the violence had stripped her down to her essential core, and what she found there was not brittle, but steel. She would not be a weakness. She would be a weapon. She picked up the flare gun. 2 cartridges left. "They'll come through the door and the window at the same time," she said, her voice low and steady. He glanced at her, surprised by her tactical assessment. "They expect you to be focused on the door. They'll see me as a non-threat, a hostage." "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice sharp. "No," she said, and the word was absolute. "They'll come for me to get to you. Let them." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a fierce, protective refusal. But there was no time to argue. The splintering crash of the cabin door being kicked in was their signal. A man burst in, weapon raised. Jin-woo fired once, a precise, economical movement. The man fell, but as Avery predicted, 2 more were smashing through the window. Their focus was on her. One of them lunged, grabbing her arm. He underestimated her. She brought the flare gun up and fired it directly into the chest of the man holding her. He screamed, stumbling back, his clothes igniting in a horrific burst of red chemical fire. The distraction was total. Jin-woo dealt with the second man before he could even register what had happened. The cabin was filled with the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder. The immediate threat was over, but they could hear more men shouting outside, regrouping. Jin-woo moved to her side, his eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. He gripped her shoulders, his hands gentle but firm. He scanned her for injuries, his gaze frantic. "They came for you because you are mine," he said, the words torn from him, raw and unguarded. It was not a confession of love. It was a statement of absolute, irrevocable fact. A law of his universe. I will not let that happen again. Just then, a new sound cut through the air, drowning out the shouts of their attackers. The thumping, powerful beat of helicopter rotors. It grew louder, closer, a deafening roar that shook the small cabin. It was not the enemy. The sound was different, heavier. It was rescue. His rescue. His soldiers, clad in black tactical gear, descended from the helicopter, securing the area with brutal efficiency. The fight was over in minutes. Sangchul's men were either dead or captured. The war for the mountain was won. One of his lieutenants approached, bowing his head slightly to Jinwoo.
Boss.
We have secured the perimeter. Jinwoo just nodded, his attention still fixed on Avery. The mask was back in place, but she had seen what was beneath it. She knew. The cost of their survival was written in the blood on the snow and the smoke in the air. Her old life, her simple, orderly world of schedules and memos, was gone. It had been burned away in a plane crash and forged into something new in the crucible of these mountains. She could never go back. As they walked toward the waiting helicopter, the downdraft whipping her hair across her face, Jinwoo stopped. The noise was immense, the soldiers moving around them with purpose. But in that moment, they were in a pocket of stillness. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers. He did not ask her to come. He did not command her. He simply held out his hand.
It was a choice.
She could refuse. She could ask to be taken somewhere safe, to be given a new identity, to disappear. She could try to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Or she could step into his. A world of violence and shadows, of loyalty and blood. A world where a man like him would burn everything to the ground to keep what he had claimed. She looked at his outstretched hand, then back to his face. She saw the cold, lethal boss. She saw the man haunted by a ghost named Mian. And she saw the man who had shielded her with his own body. She told herself it was survival instinct. She was lying to herself. Avery placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, possessive grip that was both a comfort and a cage. As he led her onto the helicopter and the door slid shut, sealing them inside, she watched the white, desolate landscape fall away beneath them. She had survived the wilderness. Now, she was willingly stepping into his.